When the Beatles hit the big time, it really was something new. They were just so big, the biggest band that has ever been, hands down. They changed Western culture. When they recorded new music, they changed the whole music industry worldwide, as everyone scrambled to emulate them. They did something truly unexpected in hitting those heights. But here's the strange thing. Many bands have since set out with an aim to be bigger than the Beatles, but not one, not a single one, has actually achieved it. I think probably for many years after the Beatles split, people were looking out for the next band to show up, do the same thing, and open up even greater heights and new frontiers of musical superstardom. But that next band that would outstrip the Beatles never came. And here we are in 2024, 60 years after the Beatles exploded onto the scene, and still no one has beaten them. So, did we really already have the biggest and greatest rock group of all time within just the first few decades of that scene appearing? And if so, what was it that they had that nobody else yet has managed to emulate? Well, let's start off by asking the question, what does that actually mean? Bigger than the Beatles is actually a fairly vague term. Was Michael Jackson bigger than the Beatles in the 80s? Is Taylor Swift bigger than the Beatles now? One of the most common definitions and explanations you get is they just had better written songs. But, in my opinion, that is such a subjective thing that it's hard to pin it down to that, really. I've done plenty of videos on the Beatles on my channel, and one of the most common comments I get is, the Beatles songs were overrated and some other band were way better. Whether a song or a whole body of work is good or bad is totally subjective, really, so I think it's hard to use that to measure it. So, if we can't necessarily say it's who had the best songs, could we say it's who sold the most records? If you look at the Wikipedia page listing the biggest selling albums of all time, Michael Jackson holds the #1 spot with Thriller, but the Beatles aren't even in the top category of 40 million copies or more for any individual album. And yet, the whole world doesn't sit on the edge of its seat waiting for the latest posthumous Michael Jackson release, nor do his fans break down everything he ever wrote and recorded, analyse and dissect it obsessively. Even though Michael Jackson did have the biggest selling album with Thriller, somehow, culturally speaking, the Beatles worldwide do seem to have the advantage still. And when you look at the list, you can even see film soundtracks in the lists of best-selling albums. So again, just like they had better songs, I don't think you can entirely boil it down to just they sold the most records. So then, could we say it's about doing the biggest live concerts? Does that make you the biggest band that ever existed? Again, we have to say no. The Wikipedia page for the most attended concerts doesn't even feature the Beatles. Robbie Williams, Garth Brooks and Shakira all come in with higher gig attendances. Of course, fantastically written songs, massive album sales and huge live concerts are a part of it, but they are not it. The Beatles had something else that set them above the rest, something that couldn't be measured by money, ticket sales or the music charts. Many bands down through the decades have created a bit of a buzz around themselves. Many have also managed to move on to the next level, building a serious following and a movement around their music. Very few, however, have managed to move into the next stage, which is obsession and hysteria. Here's a short clip from Anthology 3 highlighting the reception the Beatles received when they went to Australia.
When the Beatles arrived in Adelaide, they were greeted by 300,000 fans, which isn't surprising when you consider that the Beatles occupy the top 6 placings on the Australian chart. It looks as though Australia is truly in the grip of Beatlemania.
That was like heroes welcome, that was. It could get a bit wearing, but that certainly wasn't. When there was that many people, you were just flabbergasted.
Yeah, shocked and stunned. Just happy that it was, we're still popular down here too. Nice feeling. Everybody's saying, there's more people here than came to see the Queen.
It's funny, but there was more people came to see us there than anywhere. I mean, I think the whole of Australia was there.
We were on the roof of some hotel. I don't know if it was Sydney or Adelaide or where it was, but it was Australia, and there was thousands and thousands of kids. There was some guy on crutches. I don't know why, I just was focused in on this guy at the time. he was shouting and getting all excited, and I actually saw him, like, throw his crutches away, you know, sort of like he was healed. And he fell right in his face. I mean, he just fell over.
And there you can see it. The big difference between the Beatles and all other musical acts was this. It wasn't just the music, it wasn't just the album sales, it wasn't just the live concerts, even though they had all those things. It was the level of hype, excitement, momentum, and reverence attached to the entity, the Beatles. And just listen to this from the back cover of Beatles for Sale, their fourth album. When, in a generation or so, a radioactive, cigar-smoking child picnicking on Saturn asks you what the Beatle affair was all about, don't try to explain all about the long hair and the screams. Just play them a few tracks from this album, and he'll probably understand. The kids of AD 2000 will draw from the music much the same sense of well-being and warmth as we do today. Okay, kids don't smoke cigars or picnic on Saturn, but in a sense that was quite prophetic, because the year 2000 has already come and gone, and everyone is still listening to and talking about the Beatles. The jokey, tongue-in-cheek stuff aside, that was an accurate prediction. And this is the area in which the Beatles did something that seemingly no other band has ever equalled. They went from stage 1, hype and excitement, to stage 2, a serious, dedicated following and movement. Then they went into stage 3, obsession and hysteria. After which, they ascended to a very, very rare fourth and final stage. And let's call this what it is. The Beatles became objects of worship.
Well, I mean, wherever they went, there were hordes of people trying to get hold of them, trying to get their autographs, trying to touch them. It was like everywhere they went, they were brought cripples, by the way. You know, I mean, there was a sort of thing that went around. Look out, fellas, cripples coming. And they wheel in all the paraplegics so they could touch them. It was like Jesus almost.
There were a lot of people pushing wheelchairs who were bonkers. The people in the wheelchairs were victims of whatever it was that got them in the wheelchair, and also the prisoners of these people. And that situation did become nightmarish.
And they got to really listen and like us, and then this screaming thing started.
They used us as an excuse to go mad. The world did, and then blamed it on us. And we were just in the middle of that in a car or a hotel room. We couldn't really do much.
For us, it was just a drag, you know. We knew that they wouldn't hear anything because it's just, you know, like a riot.
It felt dangerous, you know, because everybody was out of hand and out of line. Even the cops were out of line. You know, they were all just caught up in the mania. You know, it was like they were in this big movie, and it was like we were the ones trapped in the middle of it while everybody else was going mad.
They moved into the very top level, a kind of religious fervour in which people were bringing their lame just in the hopes of meeting the Beatles, and fanatical crowds thronged the streets, screaming out their names. When John Lennon claimed the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, he may have been right or wrong, but either way, he recognised that they were being given treatment in the same league. So today, that's what I want to look at. How did the Beatles go from complete unknowns in the early 60s to objects of global hysteria and literally the focus of worship in just a few short years? Yes, they were young, handsome and talented, but so are loads of bands. It takes more than that to reach those heights. So next, I want to give you what I personally believe the answer to that question is. I want to talk to you about something I call the listening lens. Myself, being a teenage lad in the 90s, I grew up listening to all the Britpop bands, and a side product of being mad into Britpop was all those bands would constantly point back to the 60s. So, if you were a 90s British indie guitar nut, like I was and still am, by extension, generally speaking at least, you were also a massive fan of the British music from the 60s. I was in a shop with my family. I think we were buying like paint and nails or something. I knew all about Oasis, and through them, I discovered the Beatles as well. But at that time, I only really knew the hits. As we were browsing through the aisles in the shop, a song was playing over the loudspeakers. It was called Drive My Car, and I didn't know who was singing it, but I do remember very clearly my instant reaction to the first time I heard that song. It was something along the lines of, wow, What is this rubbish, poppy, twee bullshit? Is this the Monkees or something? This is literally one of the worst songs I have ever heard in my life. Heresy, I know, but that was my totally honest gut reaction to the first time I heard that song, not knowing any context and not knowing who was singing it. I thought it was absolute garbage. But as time went by, I got deeper and deeper into the Beatles, and at one point I bought Rubber Soul. And that was when I discovered that Drive My Car was in fact a Beatles song, the opening track on that album. And when those two facts collided, I remember it so clearly. A kind of paradigm shift occurred in my head. Oh, this is a Beatles song? Perhaps I was wrong about it. I went back, listened again, and abracadabra, I ended up loving it. However, I was actually a bit alarmed at myself. In the purest sense, listening to that song in a vacuum, I had fucking hated it. That had been my honest knee-jerk reaction to hearing it on the radio. But now, with the context of the Beatles being added, all of a sudden I liked it. Nothing had changed about the song itself, nothing whatsoever. Why the hell did teenage me now think it was actually a decent tune? I kind of realised something about myself and possibly about humanity in general through that experience. And this is my theory at least. I believe most people think they listen to music like this. But the truth is there is actually a third layer to this equation. What we know and think about the people who made the song massively influences how we hear it and how we rate it as a piece of music. There is almost always a kind of filter between the music and your ear, which affects how you kind of see the song. And I call this the listening lens. And this listening lens contains information about who made the record. And if you're hearing a song you actually don't have any background information about, you kind of fill that lens with guesswork, like I did, saying, this could be by the Monkees. As another more up-to-date example of this, when I first heard the last Beatles single, Now and Then, I was actually listening to the original John Lennon demo just stripped back and bare. And when I first heard this song and this demo, my reaction was pretty much exactly the same as George Harrison's had actually been. It's just not that good. A pretty weak song, probably best left alone, exactly like George had felt. But then, when it was released with the other Beatles on the track, cleaned up, with a story and context woven around the song, once again my mind began to change. The Beatles team pumped so much nostalgia and meaning into that listening lens through which the public received the song. Actually purchasing and receiving, in real time, the final Beatles single on vinyl and tape was a magical moment. Hearing John Lennon's voice cleaned up and properly mixed on a new track was magical. Seeing the nostalgia overload music video by Peter Jackson, for all its slightly cheesy edge, just added more and more emotion to the impact and the power of the release. And everyone seemed to be talking about it and buzzing with excitement about it, to the point that the vast billowing cloud of context around the song became so strong and so dominant that it actually overpowered the content of the song itself again. Another Beatles song that I objectively did not like when I listened to it in a vacuum, all of a sudden I liked when that lens was slotted into place. So the thing that transforms a song into more than a song, that elevates an ordinary band into some colossal, unstoppable avalanche, in my opinion, is not just the content of the music. If that were true, the greatest musical heroes in the world being mobbed in the streets would be genius musicians like Guthrie Govan, Victor Wooten, or Tommy Emmanuel. But, of course, they're not. The real determining factor that takes a band from unknowns to objects of worship is not really the content of the music. Mostly, it's the content of the lens. Let's imagine a scale of 1 to 50, a scale of garbage to greatness. In my theory, the listening lens determines where we put a song on that scale when we first hear it. But it's not just our personal opinions that affect what we put in this kind of listening lens that filters the song. It's also massively affected by what everyone else seems to be saying about the artist as well. And perhaps that's the biggest thing that influences the information we attach to that lens. And that's why bands and their public relation teams work so incredibly hard to monitor and control what is being said about them in the public sphere, whether online today or in the main music publications back in the day. Probably most people out in the general public have a fear of being left out, of missing out or being left behind. And we are incredibly influenced by the majority verdict. In many cases, that's literally all we use to determine what is normal. And if everyone seems to be saying something, but we hold a dissenting view, we tend to very quickly question ourselves and wonder if maybe we've got it wrong. And so, if a band has really good management, they are able to either use real events or create manipulated events to give the impression that everyone is saying this good thing about this band, and so a buzz develops. If a team can create the impression that this band is a bandwagon that everyone seems to be jumping aboard, after a while, it starts to take on life and momentum all of its own, because we, the public, like a herd of wildebeest, all start actually joining the movement, simply because everyone else seems to be. It becomes a runaway success, and if it's managed and manipulated properly, what started out as hype, buzz and excitement gives way to dedication and love. And if there is an absolute master at the wheel of the bandwagon, this can be pushed and pushed and pushed right up into obsession, hysteria, and then worship. But of course, hype alone is not enough. When people hear the hype and then go investigate, they have to find something great at the other end. I think we've probably all encountered bands or musicians who are all hype and no substance. That doesn't work. But the Beatles had both. To actually replicate what the Beatles did, you need both of those things in balance. You need musical genius, see Lennon and McCartney, and you also need someone else to manage your public image and to carefully craft and curate what is put out there about you to influence people. And the Beatles certainly had that. Frankly, I think they may have had the greatest public relations master craftsman ever to have lived. At the helm of managing the lens for the Beatles was a man who, in my opinion, was the Leonardo da Vinci of predicting, managing, manipulating and controlling how the public were going to react to what they saw on TV and heard on the radio about his charges. And that man, of course, was Brian Epstein. So now, let's take a look at Brian and how he worked tirelessly behind the scenes with a touch of genius to pave and smooth the way for the Beatles at every single turn. He worked mostly out of sight with top-level industry gatekeepers to keep the wheels turning behind the scenes, smooth over the cracks, and to ensure the Beatles got the absolute best possible promotion and exposure. Just listen to this from his book, A Cellar Full of Noise, in which he talks about what he did in paving the way for the Beatles in America. Operation USA started in November 1963. I went to New York to find out why the Beatles, who were the biggest thing the British pop world had ever known, hadn't happened in America. The trip cost me £2,000 because I booked into an extremely good hotel and we lived demonstrably well in order to impress the Americans that we were people of some importance. So just look at how, from the word go, Brian Epstein was in complete command of the impression he was giving to other people. Practically his every move was done with design and intention to control and predict the reactions of the people on the other end. To the point that he even intentionally booked into outrageously expensive hotels to give the impression in America that he already was a big shot over there. As in London in 1962, I started the rounds of the various companies, the television people and the recording firms. I contacted Walter Hoffer, who has since become my American attorney, and I met Ed Sullivan. He kind of ingratiated himself into the New York socialites world. He had an American lawyer, and he managed to personally meet the biggest talk show host in the city, Ed Sullivan. This was before the Beatles' first visit to America. He had no status and no standing in New York. He had done nothing there. And yet, just through sheer prodigious social skill, he was able to personally meet the top guy at the top American chat show. Unbelievable. And the way that meeting came about is no less remarkable, because apparently, initially, an agent offered to get the band onto the Ed Sullivan Show, and Brian Epstein turned him down for that exact reason. He wanted it to happen, but he wanted it to happen on his own terms, playing his own game. He said, "I turned this offer down because I preferred to do direct business, and this policy paid off. I went to see Ed Sullivan at his hotel in New York, and I found him a most genial fellow. After a lot of discussion, we arranged bookings for 3 Ed Sullivan shows for the Beatles and 2 Ed Sullivan shows for Jerry and the Pacemakers, and a fine working and personal relationship was set up between the two of us. There were contractual difficulties, and it took all of 4 days to resolve a certain point. My point was that the Beatles should in fact receive top billing on each occasion. This was contested vaguely by Sullivan, who seemed to sense the importance or coming importance of the Beatles, but rejected my view that they were going to be the biggest thing in the world. His producer, a friend of ours now, has told me since that he told Sullivan it was ridiculous to give me top billing because a group hadn't made it big in the States for a long, long time, and certainly not an English group. However, we got our top billing, and I returned to England with these contracts." What an absolute master craftsman Brian Epstein really was. He had, apparently, in a very short span of time, managed to convince the New York world that he really was a big shot, bypass all the agents, and literally sit down with the man himself, Ed Sullivan, and negotiate on equal terms as a peer. And just look at how he related to him with such confidence and front on direct negotiating terms. He didn't come with cap in hand. He didn't leap at the agent's offer, because that wasn't dealing as equals. He carried himself as a man of equal worth and influence, and as a result was literally treated as one. And of course, the Beatles got their top billing, and Brian Epstein was working a million other angles behind the scenes, and so, when they landed, mass hysteria, biggest thing New York had ever seen. Brian Epstein was an absolute master of human behaviour. He knew how to relate to all the power brokers, all the gatekeepers behind the scenes, as one of their own. Because of the way he dressed and his accent and his manner, he came across as a member of the influential, taste-making elite. But it wasn't just that. He knew how to relate to everyone on their level. He knew how to relate to the Beatles as an indulgent older brother who genuinely loved them and wanted them to succeed. But his incredible skill at one-to-one relationships wasn't his superpower. That was his ability to do exactly the same thing with exactly the same level of delicacy and intelligence, scaled up to the entire general public. He really was a genius. I wonder if behind the scenes he just did whatever it took to secure that billing on the Ed Sullivan Show. I wonder if money changed hands. Who knows? And, to be honest, there is a hell of a lot of unanswered questions about the Beatles' first visit to America. It always struck me as incredibly strange how they broke America without even being there. No other band did that. Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Cream, all those invasion bands had to tour as support acts and build up a following slowly, patiently, over years. And of course, that makes perfect sense. Logically, how else would you do it? However, of course, the Beatles were the complete exception. They just rolled into town for the first time to absolute top billing hysteria that took on an unstoppable life and momentum of its own. Who was responsible for that? Brian.
But at that time I didn't realise that Capitol Records had been told they wanted to have the Beatles, you see. Then Brian Epstein said, OK, well, you can have them then, on condition you spend $70,000, which sounded enormous, but they did. So that was part of the deal. They had to promote us, but plus Ed Sullivan had seen us in England, and all the Time and Life and Newsweek had all put covers of the Beatles on their magazines prior to us arriving. So it was a surprise, though, because we thought we'd have to work a little bit for this notoriety.
Behind the scenes, Brian Epstein had been using his charm and social mastery to assure that the Beatles got played and promoted constantly in the run-up to their visit. I think it's entirely possible that he paid for this as well. He also took full advantage of the footage and reports of Beatlemania in the UK, which of course he had also helped to engineer, to leverage the American audiences into the same "we don't want to be left behind" mindset. He was the ringleader of that entire circus, and he knew exactly what to do and say to keep the audience directly in the palm of his hand. Listen to his own account of how he learned his trade in human behaviour right at the ground level, working for the family business in Liverpool, selling furniture. My starting pay as a furniture salesman was £5 a week, which seemed quite a lot. And the day after I joined the business, I sold a £12 dining table to a woman who had come into the shop for a mirror. And this was a pleasurable experience, not because I wanted the woman to part with money she should have spent on a mirror, but because I honestly felt she would be better off with a dining table. This is a principle I have applied in business since, because I believe that it is a salesman's job. The buyer must be convinced that what he wanted would not be good for him, and that what he does not want would be very good for him. Day by day, I began to enjoy procuring other people's confidence, watching them relax and show trust in me. It was pleasurable to see the wary look dissolve, to know that they believed good things were ahead for them and that I would be the provider. I learned a lot about window dressing and very much more about people and their desire to be convinced and persuaded. So, there you have it. He learned all about people, humanity and human nature there on the shop floor, in real life. And I believe he was able to scale up these abilities when it came to his next few career moves, one of which was opening a record store, and the next which was managing the Beatles. He said, "The Beatles have always been happy to leave timings, plots, plans, schemes and the development of their career to me because they were good enough to trust me." What interesting word choices there. Plots, plans and schemes. Just from that sentence alone, we should be able to recognise that the Beatles' dazzling ascent was not just the organic result of them being exceptional musicians. There was vast promotional and hype machinery going on behind the scenes, with Epstein at the controls. But have I got it right here? Was the Beatles' runaway success not just down to the brilliance of their music? Many Beatles fans will probably take issue with me on this, saying the songs were enough. And most people do think this is the case, to the point that you can even get a movie like Yesterday, in which there is a freak accident, following which no one remembers who the Beatles are except for one guy. This one guy releases all their songs and becomes a global megastar simply on the power of the music alone. This, of course, however, is a complete work of fiction, both in the literal sense and the logical sense. Because there were occasional moments that we can examine at the beginning of their career, in the middle of their career, and at the end of their career, where their music actually did get analysed in a vacuum. Rare occasional moments where people were able to evaluate their songs without the lens of the Beatles. And, interestingly, their music got a much more lukewarm response every time it was presented without the attachment of the Beatles' name. Let's start in the early days. It's fascinating to note that whenever their stuff was presented to pretty much anyone in the industry back then, it was rated as average and unimpressive repeatedly. The record company Decca famously turned the band down, saying they were nothing special. Producer George Martin thought they were nothing special when he first heard them, and he only agreed to even record them in the first place because the band and Epstein charmed him behind the scenes. Ed Sullivan's team also thought the Beatles were nothing to write home about. Before the days of the bandwagon, before there was any magic or mythology attached to the name The Beatles, pretty much everyone in the industry who heard them just went, eh. And they were right. It was only when the hysteria started that everyone started changing their verdicts, jumping on board and acclaiming everything McCartney and Lennon did as genius. And it seems that Paul McCartney, at least, suspected that this was the case. Let's look at another example from the middle of Beatlemania. By this time, the name The Beatles had become so massive that the content of the music was starting to matter less than the fact that it was simply them releasing it, and it seems that Paul McCartney had started to suspect as much. In 1966, Paul McCartney was also writing songs for other artists, and he wrote a song called Woman for British duo Peter and Gordon. Paul had asked that Woman be released under a pseudonym, with the songwriting credit given to the imaginary Bernard Webb. The reason for doing this was that some of the press were suggesting that the Beatles' stature had reached a point where anything with their name on it, or anything with a Beatles name on it, would inevitably be successful, regardless of its intrinsic merit and quality. And I think this pissed Paul off a bit, because nobody likes to be thought of as resting on his laurels or relying on his name for success. However, the publishing credit was Lennon and McCartney's company, Northern Songs, and according to Gordon Waller, it took 2 weeks for the song's real pedigree to be revealed. The duo's single did become a minor hit, reaching number 14 in the US and number 28 in the UK, but not before its author's true identity was publicly revealed. And now, let's look at the songs the Beatles were working on right at the end of their careers. Most of the songs in that latter era were written by just Paul, John, or George alone. They were solo compositions, but released under the Beatle name. All you have to do is look at the hysteria that accompanied a Beatles release and compare it to how solo tracks that didn't have the Beatles name over them were received. Within just a few years after the Beatles split up, many of their songs written by the same authors during that same period while the band were together were then released on solo records. And yet, none of the same hysteria actually followed. None of the Beatles' solo records or albums came close to the hysterics of Beatlemania. Why not? They were, after all, written and performed by the same people. In fact, quite a few Beatles tracks only featured one member of the band anyway. So why did a Paul McCartney-penned song, featuring just Paul McCartney, become a thing of myth and legend when released under the Beatle name, and a bit more of a throwaway thing, just a song, so to speak, when released with Wings or as a solo project? We could argue exactly the same thing today. What if the last Beatles single, Now and Then, was released just as a Paul McCartney solo record? Would it have received the same level of hype and buzz? Definitely not. Even the component members of the Beatles had nothing on their own compared to the mythology and legend that Epstein had created around the holy entity, the Beatles. The reverence and awe contained in the listening lens that bore that name has never ever been beaten or even equalled since. And in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons is that so many musicians focus only on this, instead of also allocating equal focus to this. So that's my take, and I'm going to wrap up this video with a question. Can the Beatles be beaten? And I'm going to give a probably somewhat unexpected answer to that question. Yes, and I believe they've already been at least challenged for a brief period, but not by a band or a musician, but by the corporation Apple for a short while when Steve Jobs was at the helm. I lived in the States for 5 years during the Steve Jobs era, and in that time, I bought an iPod for $400. That iPod did just one thing. It played back MP3s through headphones. I could have bought a no-name MP3 player that would do exactly the same thing with exactly the same amount of storage and sound quality for under $100. But I bought the iPod, and here's the weird thing. I knew I was paying over the odds, but the lens attached to the Apple brand, the name of Steve Jobs and the product he was creating was so strong and receiving such universal praise that just owning that thing made me happier than an equivalent MP3 player would have done from a different company whose name had no lens, no reputation, no meaning attached. Such is the power of the lens through which we view anything, whether it be music or technology. The respect attached to the maker can be literally so powerful that it obscures the function of the thing itself. Imagine how you would feel as a 100% paid-up committed Christian if an ancient text was discovered with the lost ending of the Gospel of Mark, containing new words from Jesus Christ. Even if the words it contained were not particularly interesting, it wouldn't matter. The fact that they were spoken by Jesus would guarantee they will be analysed, discussed, dissected and held in reverence for as long as that book was still being read. And that is what we're talking about here. It doesn't matter how great your music is, if you are not very, very carefully controlling and curating what people are saying about you and the listening lens through which people are hearing, rating and interpreting your music. So if you're a musician, a manager or a promoter, that is the pathway to actually beating the Beatles. You need what they had and what Apple had. A fantastic product on one side of the equation, genuinely brilliant songs of the highest quality. But on the other side, you need a very carefully managed and curated listening lens. You need to manage the situation so that the tastemakers and gatekeepers are talking up your band or your product. And if the thing is managed and maintained properly, it can become an all-destroying avalanche. If this thing is tended and encouraged all the way and enabled to reach its full chaotic potential, it could result in your music being elevated to the level that commentators write on the back of your album, people will still be listening to this music in 3000 AD.